This is Pet Life Radio. Let's talk pets.
Welcome to Animal Rights on Pet Life Radio. This is your host, Tim Link, and I'm so excited that you're joining today. We got a fantastic couple of authors, so it's always cool when we have a couple of authors who have joined together to create such a wonderful book and masterpiece here. Of course, we're talking about Bill Wasik and Monica Murphy, who's written the latest book, Our Kindred Creatures, How Americans Came to Feel the Way They Do About the Animals. Okay, about our animals. So it's always interesting. I was just born with it, I thought, but maybe there's more to it than that. So we're going to talk to Bill and Monica a little bit about the book itself, and then we'll talk about the writing of the book and how easy that was, I'm sure. And learn a lot and have a lot of fun with it as well. So everybody hang tight. We'll come back right after this commercial break. You're listening to Animal Rights on Pet Life Radio.
Take a bite out of your competition. Advertise your business with an ad in Pet Life Radio podcasts and radio shows. There is no other pet-related media that is as large and reaches more pet parents and pet lovers than Pet Life Radio. With over 7 million monthly listeners, Pet Life Radio podcasts are available on all major podcast platforms. And our live radio stream goes out to over 250 million subscribers on iHeartRadio, Odyssey, TuneIn, and other streaming apps. For more information on how you can advertise on the #1 pet podcast and radio network, visit PetLifeRadio.com/advertise today.
Let's Talk Pets on PetLifeRadio.com.
Welcome back to Animal Rights on Pet Life Radio. Joining me now is the editorial director of the New York Times Magazine, Bill Wasik, and veterinarian and writer Monica Murphy. Talk to us about the latest book, Our Kindred Creatures, How Americans Came to Feel the Way They Do About Animals. So, Bill and Monica, welcome to the show.
Hi there.
Thank you.
Yeah, excited to have you on here because it's obviously a very interesting topic. And I think when I first looked at them, I don't know how many people have actually stopped to think about how do we become such kindred spirits and human companions in some cases to animals in our domestic life as well as all the animals around us. So tell us a little bit about the book and how it came to be.
Yeah, well, when we say how Americans came to feel the way they do about animals, we sort of mean the really contradictory attitudes that we have towards animals. So, dogs and cats increasingly become sort of like members of the family. We've become, in many cases, very concerned about wildlife species, about conservation issues. And yet, then, of course, there are all these animals, especially food animals, that are sort of off there, out in a shadow realm where we benefit from them and we use them, but we're often really not very aware of or concerned about their treatment. So, I think what we saw during the period we write about, which is from essentially 1866 until the end of the 19th century, about 3 decades there, is that we really see the development of that complex of contradictory attitudes around animals, where you see the rise of pampered pet keeping, but you also see things like rise of medical research on animals, the rise of the industrial meat industry, even as you also have the rise of veterinary medicine, the rise of the early conservation movement. And we've tried to sort of braid those stories to make what we hope is a really compelling narrative of how American attitudes changed during that time.
Yeah, and I thought it was fascinating in the book, many fascinating things about it, but one thing that was the chronological or the historical history dating back to, like you said, 1866 to, say, present time, the real shift that we've seen in our domestic animals, and then also just how we treat animals for things like consumption as well as research and testing.
That's right. The beginning of this period, which was before the animal welfare movement was here in America, or just as it was coming, animals were considered property. In some cases, they were considered companions, but sort of in any official sense or any sort of mutually acknowledged sense across society, animals' feelings weren't really considered at all. So that impacted how humanely the horses who moved freight around were treated. It impacted how sort of excess dogs and cats were treated. And it meant that the animals who contributed to the food we eat and so on, I mean, their well-being wasn't really considered at all. So a lot of the change we're documenting is very sort of welcome to modern sensibilities, because it's the origin of the idea that even the animals who feed us or move our stuff around deserve to be treated with some degree of compassion, some basic, humanity. And some amongst those animals we sort of take into our homes and make part of our families.
Right. And where do you see a shift? Was there a certain period of time that there was a drastic shift, or did it come about more of just a series of organizations and groups looking at more of the, say, cruelty to animals, we'll say, or at least animal welfare? Was there a particular set of shifts, or was this over a gradual period of years, hundreds of years?
Well, we're just focused, we're focused mostly on the 30 years right after the Civil War. The arrival of these organizations. So, most of your listeners will know the name, the ASPCA. When it originally started, it was the first animal welfare organization in the country. And even though it was called the American Society for the Prevention of Cruelty to Animals, it actually was just active in New York State. And the founder of that group, Henry Berg, went to Albany and passed a law to basically make it possible for his own group to prosecute cases of cruelty to animals. And what we find is that when that group starts, and then a number of them start up all around the country, to the point where, even 10 years after that, you then have most of the country protected by these new groups and these new anti-cruelty laws. They really make a difference, not just because they change the laws, but also they really change the norms. It used to be seen as you could sort of treat your horse the way you wanted to in the street, and nobody would really judge you for it. And these organizations, it wasn't just prosecution, it was the fact that they kind of created the sense that, hey, that's not okay anymore. And so, in the research that we've done, the changes can happen pretty fast. Some of the other changes that we've written about happen very slowly. So, for example, the rise of the industrial meat industry, you start to see centralization with the stockyards happening right after the Civil War. And then you start to see the rise of meat packing, which allows for the animals not just to all be raised in the middle of the country, but to also be slaughtered in the middle of the country and their meat shipped by rail. And then sort of by the time you get to the end of this time period, you suddenly have a system where millions of animals are being raised, they're being slaughtered, their meat is being shipped, and it's all happening outside of kind of traditional human communities in these places where it's just an entire city basically devoted to raising and killing animals. And it's not to say that they were, trying to be cruel to the animals, but it was just a very different way of thinking about how food animals were treated. And we do think that it's had the consequence of kind of allowing some of our own kind of responsibility for how those animals are treated to kind of fall away, because we now live in a world where they're all so far from us. So to answer your question, I think sometimes these things happen really relatively quickly, and sometimes they happen very slowly and kind of subtly.
Yeah. And looking back on it, when we're talking even, say, 100 years ago, I would say that when you look at, say, a farm, for instance, the livestock there was a central part of life. It was their living. And I would say that oftentimes the animals were treated with respect, and maybe more humanely, because a farmer may only have X number of cows or sheep or goats or whatever it may be right there on site that they have to take care of on a daily basis, where compared to what we've seen later in the years and presently, like you had mentioned, it seems to be more spread out and less, per se, similar to where it was in the olden days, we'll say. Would that be a fair statement?
I think so. I mean, a lot of the sort of before and after you describe is really has to do with the phenomenon of urbanization, which is very much happening during the time period we research. And urbanization not only changes the way people were living with livestock, but also, interestingly, their reliance on horses, because the cities were big economic centers, and there was a lot of movement of goods, and even as industrialization was creating new machines to power industry, there were horses bringing coal to fuel the machines. So there is a sort of before and after affecting livestock and other animals. And some animals are sort of at a greater remove. Some animals are closer because, when you live in an apartment, you don't have a yard dog anymore. So I think that we examine these phenomena, sort of considering different kinds of animals in turn and the various ways the relationships are transformed. But this is, all being informed at the time by also, new beliefs about animals that more or less resemble a lot of the beliefs we have today.
Do you feel the beliefs came about just through societal changes, or was it better access to information and awareness of the animals? How did you see that shift sort of start to really? Because the way I envision it is, as you said, early days, a lot of them were working animals. They weren't necessarily treated with respect. As a matter of fact, they weren't treated with respect. And then there seemed to be this shift where I envision it like this giant boulder going down a hill, and it just picked up steam over and over, and almost like people realized, you know what, I always wanted to treat the animals with respect. I didn't think anybody else did. But now that I know there are others, it seems to be moving forward. So do you think it's more of because just society changes and infrastructure changes, or is it more of access to more research and more people around you that may be more like-minded to take care of the animals?
Well, I think it's largely a function of activism and the work of specific people who really got it about animals and brought a message to everybody using, laws and the press and really just getting out there in the streets where people could see them, that animals, experience cruelty and suffer and deserve to be treated in a decent way, and that they brought this message home to many people across society, and their tools we write about I think are kind of interesting because they really did sort of, just as a lot of successful activists do now, love theatricality and really inviting public interest through controversy. And so it was not a process that sort of was happening on its own or with its own momentum, although there was some of that once it got going. It really was activists like Henry Berg and George Angel and Carolyn Earl White who brought this idea to the United States and really put it in front of people's faces.
Just to piggyback on that, one of the stories that we tell in the book is about the novel Black Beauty, which lots of people read as children even today. And one of the remarkable stories from the book is that it was only 13 years after that book came out in England that it really became a sort of mega bestseller around the world. And that was because George Angel, who was the head of the Massachusetts SPCA, started pirating the book basically and just printing, tens of thousands of copies of it at a time and selling them for relatively cheap, and really created a whole sensation around it. But sort of coming back to your question, I think one of the reasons why Angel in particular was very focused on literature is that there is just a way in which changing people's minds around the issue of animal cruelty is just about forcing them to reckon with the fact that animals must have like an internal experience of joy and suffering, which, because they're not able to speak, it's possible sometimes to forget, especially if you're somebody who, relies on your horse to make a living. It's possible to forget that if you're cruel to your horse, that the horse is going to feel that pain and suffering just as keenly as you would if someone were to beat you or whatever. And Black Beauty, because it was narrated by a horse narrator, was really seen as revolutionary at the time. There hadn't been a full-length novel that had been narrated by an animal. And even though that seems kind of like old hat to us now, you look at the reviews where, grown-up readers were just very, very affected by this device of having a horse sort of write a novel and explain the kind of joys and sorrows of being a working horse, who's forced to endure the cruelty of various owners. it really made an effect on people. And so I do think that that kind of simple, golden rule, like really think about another creature and how they might like to be treated, I do think is a big engine of the change that happens during this time.
Yeah. So, tell of the test of times, the novel, obviously, like you mentioned, it still holds true today. It still holds attention today. And everybody is at least somewhat aware of the story. And if they're not fully aware, go back and read it because it's available to still be able to read through and take in and absorb the message. And I think a lot of books nowadays, a lot of novels have some framework built around that particular book.
Yeah, I think that's right.
So let's talk about briefly, I don't want to get too much into activism, but it's obviously a key part of the book. And as you mentioned, sort of steamrolling this thing forward, as I continue to mention, either by individuals or through organizations. We're obviously big believers in animal rescue here, and I'm a former president of a humane society, so I understand that part of it. But one of the things I see happening, at least from my point of view, in today's society here in America is the plus side. We have a lot of organizations focusing on all types of different animals and wanting to support them and educate and obviously raise funds to further their cause. The flip side of that is the fact that there are so many. So the plus side is there's so many, and the downside is there's so many. It could be overwhelming to individuals. Do I go and donate my time and my tether, my funds to a large organization that has a lot of pull, like the SPCA or Best Friends Society, whatever it may be, or do I look more into grassroots and look for something in my own backyard, maybe even something that's smaller that I can get involved in? Do either of you have an impression on what is best, what is good, what is great about having a plethora, or what perhaps we need to have a better focus on in order to continue to educate and get Americans involved with animal, whether it be rescue or just understanding the animals better?
Well, I work for a small rescue, and I think that for most people, the best way into an issue you care about is to find something sort of local and human scaled so that your efforts and the money you can donate really mean something. But at the origins of the animal welfare movement, we are talking about pretty big state level organizations, and there weren't a lot of choices, at least within a state. So I think those organizations and sort of what they were able to accomplish speak to the power of big organizations and sort of their ability to change laws and policy and social norms.
That makes sense. Yeah, and that's sort of been my philosophy on all this because, I will admit when I first got involved with animal rescue many, many, many moons ago, it was sort of toe in the water. Donate some money, donate some items. And then you go there and donate a little bit of time. And then the next thing you know, whatever your skill set is, whether it's sales or writing for grants or anything of this sort, which I've done plenty of those, do that and then later actually run the organization. What I have found was, for me at least, was the grassroots is a way to get actively involved and make impact in your community as well as in your state, because there are state laws and state things that, whether it's anti-tethering laws or dogfighting laws, whatever it may be. And then also support where you can the large organizations which have a little bit more pull and a little bit more might behind them and maybe a little bit more attention to get something done on a broader scale.
Yeah.
It's interesting to sort of reflect on how, we don't write at all about present day activism. All of the issues that we write about in the book are still to some degree or other live issues. And they also tend to connect to issues that go beyond animals, so conservation is a great example of where there's all this vital work being done that's about protecting animals, but also is about, other urgent issues that are happening, again, both nationally and locally around the environment. And I think that partly why, to me, the sense that you want there to be sort of a riot of organization, a patchwork of organizations, some of them local, some of them, national or global, is that it's really difficult, I think, for people for one organization's leadership to really see the challenges at sort of every level. And I think that there's a real value in having that kind of multiplicity of approaches.
I would agree. That's perfect. All right. Well, we're going to take a quick commercial break, come back and continue our conversation with authors Bill Wasik and Monica Murphy about their book, Our Kindred Creatures, How Americans Came to Feel the Way They Do About the Animals. And we'll talk to them a little bit about the writing of the book as well. So everybody hang tight. We'll come back right after this commercial break. You're listening to Animal Rights on Pet Life Radio. Hi, this is Tim Link, animal communicator and pet expert and host of Animal Rights on Pet Life Radio. Have you ever wanted to know what your pet is really thinking? Do you want to find out if they truly understand what you're trying to tell them? Or wish you could build a better understanding and closer relationship with your pet? Well, now you can. Learning to Communicate with Animals is a 4-part on-demand workshop. In the workshop, you'll learn the essential techniques that are necessary to communicate with animals, including what is animal communication, breathing correctly to achieve the perfect state to communicate with your animals at a deeper level, using guided meditation exercises, a method to communicate with animals, and how to send and receive information from your animals. So if you're wanting to learn how to communicate and connect with your animals at a deeper level, visit petliferadio.com/workshop and purchase and download Learning to Communicate with Animals. You'll be glad you did.
Let's talk pets
Let's talk pets
on Pet Life Radio.
Pet Life Radio.
PetLifeRadio.com.
Welcome back to Animal Rights on Pet Life Radio. Continue our conversation with authors Bill Wasik and Monica Murphy. Their latest book, Our Kindred Creatures, How Americans Came to Feel the Way They Do About Animals. So, Bill and Monica, we talked a little bit about the history behind it and delving into it, and there's so much great history, and really, to me, it forms the cornerstone of what is happening today and moving forward. Talk a little bit about the writing of the book. I mean, where did you, the flagstone I sort of put there, or sort of the flag in the ground was 1866. How'd you come about choosing that as a start date? And then tell us a little bit about just formulating the book, because there's just obviously tons and tons of research that went into this.
Sure.
Well, we wrote another book about rabies back in 2012, Rabid, A Cultural History of the World's Most Diabolical Virus. And that book went back to ancient times all the way up to the present day, talking about, the disease rabies and impacts it's had on humans and animals. And we discovered that we loved researching history. And in particular, we found the 19th century really, really rich and interesting, like close enough to seem relevant in critical ways to right now, but also just, weird in ways that really fascinate us from sort of today's sensibilities. And so we were brainstorming ideas for our next book, and we went through a few iterations at first that became part of this book, but didn't end up being an entire book by themselves. For example, writing about P.T. Barnum and writing about history of veterinary medicine and the horse flu of 1872, which shut down America. So these things became sort of episodes in our history, but ultimately we arrived at sort of a grander project that encompassed those and a whole bunch more. And Bill can tell you how we ended up beginning with 1866.
Yeah, well, 1866 is when Henry Bergh comes back from Europe, where he was a diplomat in the Lincoln administration, and founds the ASPCA. And the ideas behind the animal welfare movement they didn't originate in the United States. They really, started in England, like so many of the sort of humanitarian movements did. But one of the things that we realized the more that we researched was that we could really locate in this time period, so many of the different shifts that were crucial to sort of how our attitude towards animals have changed. And so, the more we got into the structure of it, more we realized, well, it wasn't just about Bergh or even just about the activists, but that it was going to be about sort of all of these different shifts and trying to sort of show how they fit together. And so the book is really constructed where there is a lot about the activists, but we're really showing how their work intersected with all of these other, economic shifts and political and cultural shifts, et cetera.
And I think also one thing we found real enjoyment in was to whatever extent we could, writing about the animals themselves, which, that it is a challenging exercise and takes some imagination sometimes, but to really not just sort of recount what the humans were doing during all this, but what the experience of the circus elephant or a beef steer was like, and sort of trying to get inside that a little bit.
Yeah, and I thought that was fascinating about the book, and I probably didn't highlight that enough because we're talking about animals in here. We're talking about America and how this came to be, but animals as a whole. And I sort of briefly touched upon there's so many different organizations doing great work for a plethora of different types of animals. But I love the fact in the book that you did sort of pick some things that we don't often stop, at least as Americans, we don't often stop and think about. We love elephants, but do we actually stop and think and learn the history and the of how they were treated compared to how they are today, especially when we're talking about the the era of P.T. Barnum. Perhaps some people know that history a little bit. Maybe they know it from the musical and the movie that was out not too long ago. But that they don't stop to think about it, even when we're talking about American zoos. Some people have strong opinions one way or another on American zoos, but the book really focuses on particular animals and how they were treated and how they're treated today. So I think you guys did a great job on that.
Thanks.
So tell me about, okay, so you're sitting there and this is what I call a meaty book. It's got, 400 some pages, a lot of notes, a lot of credits, obviously the research, as I mentioned, went to it. How do you sort of start weeding through it? Because I can sort of like, in my mind's eye, at least I envision, okay, Bill, we've got 1,200 chapters or 1,200 pages here, I should say 1,200 pages. How do we whittle that down and focus that a little bit more and without leaving out any of the good bits? Or do we save some of the good bits for the next book about maybe one specifically about P.T. Barnum or Henry Burke?
No, I mean, it was more that we kind of built it up from the different threads. I mean, we knew we wanted this story to be about, at least in part, about the animal activism during this time period. And we wanted it also to represent the arc of P.T. Barnum and his animal exhibits during this time period. We started researching the history of, medical experimentation on animals, et cetera, et cetera. And so, really the way we conceived it was it's in two parts. And generally speaking, each of these threads, other than the activism, which is kind of touches on most of the chapters, a lot of the threads sort of have like one chapter in the first part and one chapter in the second part that kind of represent basically kind of the first part of our period and the second part of the period. So the feeling is that by checking in on some of these issues at sort of two different times, at two different moments in history, you get a sense of an arc of sort of things in motion during, around each of these issues.
So writing together, obviously, how do you divide those tasks up? Is it rock, paper, scissors? Is it drawing the short straw? How do you decide, or is there certain passion or expertise that you guys focused on to put this together?
So with the first book, and perhaps I guess I realize we haven't mentioned yet that Bill and I are married. And so this is a partnership that goes beyond our writing partnership, and we have to be nice to each other as writers, as co-authors.
Yeah, it's a different set of challenges, pluses and minuses. I understand that.
But when with our first book, we very much sort of started with the writing about the things that were sort of played to our natural strengths. So because I'm a veterinarian, I wrote, when we were writing about rabies, about sort of contemporary medical treatment of rabies. I wrote about the history of vaccine development. Bill wrote about vampires and cultural phenomena and other things. But our starting point was to sort of work with the subjects which we were most knowledgeable about. With this book, we didn't do that necessarily. We more followed our interests. And so Bill ended up writing more about medical research, and I wrote about P.T. Barnum. And, no matter sort of who starts what, we do end up swapping work back and forth quite a lot. In fact, in this book, much more so than with our previous one, rather than tackling entire chapters individually before sort of handing them off back and forth, we would sort of request or assign pieces of the chapters that we were individually leading up. For example, if I were writing about the chapter about veterinarians and rabies. I asked Bill to write some about pet keeping and history of dog shows, or maybe we both wrote that. It gets a little mixed up after a while because we're so passing things back and forth, but hopefully ends up quite seamless, because by the time it reaches the reader, we've edited one another multiple times and, moved things around, inserted pieces into our, partner sections. And so it, at this point, sort of feels like a real combination of our efforts, sentence by sentence.
Yeah, well, that's fascinating. And Monica, I thought that was fascinating. Also, you said you picked what your interest is, which, I would say, okay, it's got to be something to do with medical sciences, veterinarian sciences. But no, you picked P.T. Barnum.
Yeah, I did.
Which I thought was great, too.
Yeah, I mean, I also picked the veterinarian chapters. But yeah, I think it's nice to mix it up. And I definitely, through writing these books, have developed, a real enjoyment of writing more biographical passages. And there's a lot more of that in this book than there was in our rabies book. But I don't know what strengths Bill has discovered along the way. He's pretty good at writing. It turns out.
Well, but the stuff about the medical research, I think back when we did the book about rabies, I would have been a little bit wary of taking that on. I would have worried about it feeling too technical or something. But it was actually a real pleasure to get into the kind of, these were physiological researchers, and it's really interesting to sort of throw your mind back to a time where medicine didn't really understand how the human body worked. And part of how they learned about it was through experiments on animals. I also really gravitate to sort of difficult moral questions. And I feel like that one of the things that research really gets into is that, it's nice to think from the present day that these painful experiments on animals weren't discovering anything, but in reality they were. And the question of was that worth it or not is a difficult question to answer. It does sort of form, and I think that question is still one of those very contentious questions today. And even people who see themselves as animal advocates don't necessarily. I think we can all agree that there are certain experiments that people are doing on animals that are just that are beyond the pale. But the question of where to draw that line is one that's still, I think, a really interesting question.
Yeah, and I would agree with that wholeheartedly. And I love how the book was structured in the fact that you're given a history behind it up till today without necessarily taking sides or letting your own personal opinions get into it. It's something where someone could read through the book and sort of learn a little bit about, okay, what did happen in the past? What are we doing now? And then they can formulate their own opinions, because we're not here to sway them one way or another. At least you're not doing that in this book.
Yeah, well, thank you. We definitely tried for that.
So, Bill, Monica, when everybody picks up a copy of Our Kindred Creatures, How Americans Came to Feel the Way They Do About Their Animals, when they read through it, is there a main takeaway, or is there a general message you want to leave out there that you hope at the end of the day they get and you're like, good, I did my job?
Yeah, I mean, I think perhaps more than one, but I think it's a pretty optimistic book because we document how change can happen relatively fast, sort of when the world is ready for it. Not everyone was ready for the animal welfare movement and all the changes that came with it, but they got it done. They really made a difference in their time, and we really still are seeing the benefits of what they accomplished now. So I think that's a big part of what I hope everyone will take away.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think the book does a great job of that. And, to me, it gives me some historical measure to go by. It also gave me some modern day where we're at and how things came about. Because I don't think a lot of people actually knew organizations like ASPCA, how that was formulated and why it happened, these type of things. So I think the book gives a good view of that. And to me, it gets me thinking even more. So that's always a good thing to think about better ways to handle things with the animals.
We agree.
Yeah. Well, thanks so much for talking to us about it.
Well, our pleasure, our pleasure. So everybody pick up a copy of the book. It's Our Kindred Creatures, How Americans Came to Feel the Way They Do About Their Animals. Authors Bill Wasik and Monica Murphy. Bill, Monica, thank you so much for coming on the show. Great job with the book as always. And I'll be looking for another chat with the two of you somewhere down the road.
Thanks so much.
Well, we're coming to the end of the show today. I want to thank everyone for listening to Animal Rights on Pet Life Radio. I want to thank the producers and sponsors for making this show possible. If you have any questions, ideas, or comments for the show, you can reach us at petliferadio.com. We'll be glad to answer your questions, entertain your comments, and bring on the people you want to hear from most. And while you're there, check out all the other wonderful shows and hosts. It's a cornucopia of animal fun and education. So that's at petliferadio.com. So until next time, write a great story about the animals in your life, and who knows, you may be the next guest on Animal Rights at Life Radio. Have a great day.
Let's Talk Pets, every week on demand, only on PetLifeRadio.com.